Okay, Morgan. We're in the middle of handling the sugya of doctors and doctoring and going to doctors, la halacha. And we keep mentioning that we have to talk about the Rambam, so I think this is the week that we'll talk about the Rambam. Now, I'm going to be makdim that any attempt to confine the Rambam and describe the Rambam and exactly paint the picture of the Rambam is godless, will be lacking inherently. The Rambam is, Mimoshe ad Moshe lekam k'Moshe, the Nesher HaGadol. It's almost impossible to be magdir the Rambam's greatness. The Rambam wrote the ultimate trilogy in Svarim, the Yad HaChazaka, which is, I'm saying, still probably the most written on Sefer ever. Maybe Pirkei Avos is more, but I'm saying from Rishonim, probably the most written on Sefer. The Pirush HaMishnah, the Moreh Nevuchim, which is granted for more of a narrow audience, but in its time, for hundreds of years, was controversial and consequential, and in the space of machshava and philosophy and that area, the Moreh Nevuchim is the gold standard. This is all not even including the Rambam's various igris and ksavim that he wrote to different communities, different times. And the Rambam, interestingly, he wrote Pirush HaMishnah when he was a young man, not on all of Mishnayos, but on large chunks of Mishnayos. He wrote it when he was about 30 years old, and spent the rest of his life editing it. I have a friend of mine, Big Talmid Chacham, who showed me recently a ksav yad of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnah, which is like, it's a page of handwritten text, and then in the middle there's like an X crossing off 8 lines, and then the X is erased, and on the side there's more written, and like a work in progress, like someone who was working on perfecting. And the Rambam would include later kashas that someone had or conversations that he had. The Pirush HaMishnah is something he wrote when he was a young man. It was like a work in progress. Then later the Rambam wrote Yad HaChazaka, which is probably his magnum opus, which is an incredible sefer. That's called Be'emes Kol Terakula, from Brachas through Uktzin, Halacha L'Maisa. The only difficulty or taina on the Rambam and Yad HaChazaka is that since he doesn't bring sources, it's sometimes hard to know where exactly he's coming from, what exactly the Rambam means to say, which obviously opens it up to being the popular, so to speak, canvas that the Rambam became, the Yad HaChazaka became, that allows everyone from every Kreis of Klal Yisrael to add his flavor, his stripe to the Pirush Rambam. Then the Rambam, as an older person, published the Sefer Moreh Nevuchim, which was his contribution to philosophy, heavily based on Aristotelian philosophy and popular philosophical ideas of the time, of the day. But that Sefer got the Rambam in a lot of hot water, and some of the Chachamim in France were very strongly against it. Kayidua, there was public burnings of the Moreh Nevuchim. Rabbeinu Yoina was originally a big misnagid to the Rambam, and then ultimately became a big chassid of the Rambam. So many say that the whole Sefer Rabbeinu Yoina, Shari Tshuva, was written in Rabbeinu Yoina's attempt to do tshuva for battling with the Rambam. Some say that the burning of the Shas in 1244 in Paris was because the French Jews, didn't respect the Rambam properly. And Moreh Nevuchim, the battles of Moreh Nevuchim were waged and continued burning for decades, even probably hundreds of years. There's a famous tshuva from the Rashba, where the Rashba writes, sets policy for Spanish Jewry relating to studying the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim. A lot of this is well-known things. Now, just to get the time and place locked in, the Rambam is born in the early-ish 1100s, 1143, 1138, depending on different girsayos, in the 1140 range. He was born in Cordoba, Spain. When he was 10 years old, the Almohads, who was like a militant fundamentalist Islamist, took over the area where the Rambam was living. It became inhospitable for Jews to live there, and the Rambam and his family, his father, the Dayan Rabbeinu Maimon, and his brother Reb David, all went on the road together, and they ended up taking quite a migratory pathway. They went first through Morocco to Fez, where if you've been to Morocco, Fez now, there's a house still in Fez now that says the Rambam's house. That just tells you the greatness of the Rambam. The Rambam lived there as a young man, but he was such a consequential Rishon Posek that anything that the Rambam touched, remained historic for hundreds of years after. The community cherished that area, and it became like a local legend, a local messiah, that there was the Rambam's house in Fez. In any case, they continue moving on. I think they go to Algeria, then they go to Eretz Yisrael, to Akko, which at that time was during the Crusader kingdoms. It was the middle of the 1100s during what was called the King's Crusades. King Richard the Lionheart and the King of France, whose name I don't remember the second, had led a crusade together. They actually conquered a decent amount of Eretz Yisrael, and were having a Christian kingdom in that part of Eretz Yisrael during that time. the Rambam's fame as a physician had already begun to take root, and legend has it that King Richard the Lionheart, who was the king of Britain, offered the Rambam to become his personal court physician. The Rambam turned it down because the Rambam said that Edom is Galus, Yishmael is not Galus, which is a big machlekes Rishonim. How to characterize Galus Yishmael. Klal Yisrael's interactions with Yishmael is a tremendous machlekes Rishonim in how to learn Psukim and Daniel. It's rather a topic we should cover one day. That we should cover that on its own. But the Rambam chose to go live in Islamic countries instead of getting stuck under a Christian country, and he turned down King Richard the Lionheart's job. Eventually, the Rambam and his family make it to Egypt. The Rambam at the time is still relatively young. He's writing letters, he's writing Svarim, he's doing what he's doing. He becomes the Rav, or whatever, some sort of position like a Rav in Fustat, which is Old Cairo. New Cairo, I think, was already built at the time, or was already developing at the time, because the Rambam in his letters, his personal letters, like writing about his life in Cairo, writes often about his travels from Fustat to Kahir, which he makes it sound like it's very far away, but it's really like 3 kilometers away or 5 kilometers away, not very far away. But the Jewish community was in Fustat, and the famous Cairo Geniza that we know about today, like where so many Kisvei Yadus were discovered and many things from the Rambam were discovered, was in Fustat, in Old Cairo. In any case, the Rambam lives there, and he's supported by his family. His brother, Reb David, was somewhat of a wealthy man, it seems, who made business traveling, large distance. He was a salesman, like a buyer and a seller, import-export business. And eventually, tragically, Reb David, newly married with 1 child, dies in a boat accident on the open ocean on his way to India. And the Rambam, in gut-wrenching letters, writes about his avelus, about his brother David, and ultimately the Rambam is forced to take on a job. I think someone asked me last week about this, but the Rambam is forced to take a job because he has no more parnasa. He becomes a practicing physician, a practicing doctor, and eventually the Sultan of Egypt at the time, who was a very powerful man, Egypt at the time was a very powerful kingdom, took him in to be like the court doctor and Mamela, the doctor of the whole country. And the Rambam gets incredibly busy. And the Rambam writes in his letters about his time during there, his time being a doctor. The Rambam writes that he comes in the morning. He writes about his schedule. He says he comes in the morning to the Sultan's house. Now, actually, what happens is the Sultan dies, and the Sultan's son, who was much more of a wilde mensch and had a lot more illness going on in his house, becomes the Sultan, and the Rambam's schedule just went crazy. But the Rambam writes that he travels from his house in Fustat to Cairo. He gets there in the morning, and depending on what the day's news is, will depend on how his day looks. If everybody's healthy and everything's fine, his day could be short, and he could go back home, with relative ease. But if somebody's sick, he's on house call now, and he could be there for days or weeks or whatever at a time. And he writes about he says, I'm barely eating, I'm barely sleeping, I have no time to learn. He says, when people come to me, the open hours later on, I lay flat on a bed because I don't even have energy to sit up while I'm dealing with the patients. And the Rambam, it's interesting, he's writing about his desire to juggle being the king's doctor and being a doctor to the masses. He wants to be able to help everybody. He writes a lot of letters interesting. Now, what's interesting is that there's a nidin about the Rambam. If the Rambam did the Rambam go to medical school? Well, let's just say it like that. There's a nidin amongst the chaykrim and the scholars if the Rambam went to medical school or not. It wasn't like a family tradition that was passed down. Now, what's interesting is the Rambam is clearly very, very well versed in all the ancient medicine that precedes him. He knows all about Hippocrates from Greece, and he knows all about Galen from Rome, and he quotes them by name often. He read them in Arabic translation, and you could tell, which books he read. The Rambam is very, very well versed in the ancient medicine. He knows all of it, but did he actually go to a gestempel to medical school? Did he learn it just from reading? Was he an autodidact? Did he teach it himself? Was it learned by his family? Which members of the Rambam's family and community were doctors before him? Which ones were after him? And this is like a big need and interesting, but I'm not here to talk about that today. One way or the other, the Rambam was an acclaimed doctor, recognized by the Catholic and Islamic worlds of his time, who considered him to be a doctor, a high level doctor. Today, I think there's half a dozen to a dozen hospitals named after the Rambam at any given time. Maimonides is a popular ancient medical figure. Medicine is a very Jewish field, so I guess we're a little slanted. But in any case, that's the Rambam. Now, there's many, many legends about the Rambam's doctoring that were said throughout the years, and I want to share some of them. I don't know if any particular one or if any of them at all are true or not. They're like legends. A lot of times they're written over in Yiddish books throughout the Deiros, Arabic books throughout the Deiros, and were later compiled by someone in Eretz Yisrael in the 1950s. And I'll share a few of them because they're fascinating. They're just interesting stories. There's there's a story about how the Rambam learned medicine. This is a perfect segue. How the Rambam learned medicine. Supposedly there was a elite doctor who lived near the Rambam, and it doesn't tell us where or when in the Rambam's life this took place, who refused to teach medicine to anybody because he was afraid that if he teaches medicine, his past Talmidim would become his competitors, and his monopoly on the business of medicine and the way he made money from it would evaporate, and that would be not good for him. And the Rambam understood that this doctor would be like a great person to learn it from, and the Rambam was really trying to learn from this doctor. So he presented himself to this. He saw this doctor needed an assistant, but the doctor would take nobody because he was afraid they would steal his practice. So the Rambam came to the doctor's house, he knocks on the door, and in a primitive sign language he starts motioning to him that he can't speak or hear, and he would like to be his assistant. He's looking for a job. And the doctor tries to have a conversation with him, and he's just nodding and shaking and glitching and twitching. He's just, and the doctor says, oh, this is perfect. The deaf mute is a guy I have nobody to worry about. And he takes him in, and the Rambam begins to be his assistant, and this doctor gives the Rambam lists and tells him, go out to the field and harvest this particular and this thing, and then we make a potion like this. And the Rambam is jotting this all down in his little notebook and taking it. But the problem is that even this doctor who allowed the deaf mute Rambam to be in his presence would not allow him into surgery, into the room where the procedures are actually done. So the Rambam carves a little hole into the ceiling, and he sits there every day during surgery, and he's taking notes. And this doctor, a patient comes into the doctor and says that he has a terrible migraine, that won't go away in his head. And the doctor listens and says, the symptom sounds like you have like a worm in your brain. And the way to deal with it is I cut open your skin and I have to remove it. And the doctor cuts open the skin, and he's about to yank the worm out of the guy's brain. And the Rambam remembers that in the medical procedures, as it's recorded, as he's noticed many times before, if you rip the worm out, it damages the membrane of the brain, and the patient will never heal. The way to do it is to present the worm with a little bit of food, like a piece of lettuce, and let the worm climb out on its own so that it doesn't damage the membrane when you pull it out. And the doctor's getting those tweezers out, he's about to do it, and the Rambam calls in, he says, no, you have to get the lettuce. And the doctor looks up and he sees the deaf mute watching him and stealing all his tricks. And based on whichever story goes, either he was furious or he was, pleased that the Rambam had did this, and one way or the other, this is, one of the legends, one of the stories of how the Rambam learned how to be a doctor. Another, I won't say all of them, even though there's great stories, they're all great stories, but supposedly the Rambam was one who invented a urine sample. Today in modern medicine, that's a very common way of diagnosing certain, illnesses. The Rambam invented a urine sample, and you'd be able to present a urine sample, and the Rambam would be able to isolate what was wrong with the patient. And, there were other doctors who were critical of this and thought that it was, silly, and they sent him a urine sample of somebody who was totally healthy. Let's see what you do with this. And the Rambam says, he's very ill, he needs to come live in the king's house for 3 weeks. And okay, they're laughing, we'll see how this plays out. And they bring him to live in the king's house for 3 weeks. And after a few weeks, the guy drops dead. And they couldn't believe it. Like, what is this? Well, what happened over here? And the Rambam explains to them that he had a particular ailment in his intestines, that as long as he was eating coarse, rough food of a workman, of a blue-collar worker, which what he was, it didn't get triggered. It wouldn't trigger him. But if he comes and eats the delicate foods of a king's house, this intestinal problem will flare up and he'll die. And I saw that from the sample and ala panim. Another story they say is that they brought the Rambam the urine of a donkey. And they said, what's the condition of this person? And the Rambam told them that this person whose urine he brought to me has a very particular condition. The only diet that's suitable for him is water and barley. If he eats anything else besides water and barley, he's going to die, which is the diet of a donkey. This was the Rambam's thing. There's other stories about the Rambam and some crazy story of a doctor that he was working with who figured out the elixir of life. And basically, he figured out a potion, and he told the Rambam, when I die, chop me up into, dismember my body, put me in this test tube with the potion that I created, and over time, my body will grow back together, and it will form into a new human, and something like this. And the Rambam did it, and then the Rambam had a dream that, what are you doing creating life like this? You're taking away Hashem's ability to kill people, the guy's going to live forever now. And the Rambam felt terribly guilty about it, and he went and looked at the notes again, and he saw that tucked into the back page of this doctor's notes, there was like a little petek that he wrote himself. After I get brought to life, I'll kill off Moshe ben Maimon, and I'll be the only doctor that anybody cares about. This is what it was written in the back. And the Rambam wasn't sure what to do. He had been guarding this test tube and had seen something transpiring there, and he He went to try to end the experiment, and this organism that was forming in there stuck in its hand, like to remind him that he had a shvua, you can't break it. The Rambam was ice man. He walked out, he didn't know what to do, and while he walked out, two cats came in the middle of an intense fight over a piece of food. They knocked over the test tube, it got splattered, and that was the end of the experiment. There's probably 15 of these marvelous stories about the Rambam. I don't know if they're true or not. I mean, it's hard for me to believe that these are true stories, but Hal Kapanim, they say something. They say that the Rambam was of great acclaim as a doctor, so much so that many, many urban legends, sprung up about him in various different kreiser. Some of these were written for the first time in Yiddish, some are in Ladino, some are in Arabic, until they were compiled into an organized structure. But meaning there are all sorts of stories. Now, in any case, that was a long introduction to get to something that I wanted to get to. I don't know how much of the topic we'll get to cover, but what I want to talk about is like this. The Rambam, in the end of his life, the last 10 years of his life, or 15 years of his life, the Rambam, aside from being a practicing doctor, major Posek and community leader, editor and redactor of all his rabbinic svarim, constantly editing them until the day he died, wrote, depending on your count, between 8 to 17 medical books. Now, these are medical books, plain medical books. They're not svarim, they're plain medical books. You could find some of them today have been republished in Hebrew. I mean, not some of them, all of them have been republished in Hebrew. Some of them have been published in many different languages. The Rambam wrote many medical books, and they're medicine of his day, and he covers many, many different fields. He's an expert in preventative medicine. He's an expert in dermatology. He's an expert in various kidney disease, renal diseases. He's an expert in many, many different fields, and he's an expert in some form of mental health that he discusses there. The Rambam is writing very, very widely. Now, I think it's understood that the Rambam's medical books are medical books. And if you want to come today and argue on that medical book, and you want to say, I looked up on PubMed, and it argues on this Rambam, I don't think that's not called arguing. You're not making a machlekes with the Rambam. Now, the question is that the Rambam, in Hilchos Deis, in Yad HaChazaka, in Perek Daled, inserts an entire chapter in Perek Daled of medical dinim. In Perek Daled and Hilchos Deis. And he starts off like this, Perek Daled and Hilchos Deis, sandwiched between some of the most weighty and consequential hashkafa in Yonim that the Rambam writes about. Like he starts with Hilchos Yisei Torah, then he goes into Hilchos Deis, some of the most intense, all or nothing type of hashkafa topics that the Rambam covers in Perek Daled. He segues in and he says like this, he says, Hayil v'heyois haguf bari v'shalim midarkei Hashemu, since the body should be strong and stable is something that Hashem wants, sharei afshar sheyavin ayeda v'hu chayla, a person can't, understand anything or do anything if he's sick. Tzarech adam laharchik atzmei v'dvarim ha'ma'abdin es haguf, u'lahanig atzmei v'dvarim ha'ma'avrim ha'machlimim. A person has to distance himself from things that harm his body and follow a lifestyle and a diet that enhances his body's ability to function. Ve'eluhein. And then he starts off and he's going to give a whole list of things that a person should do, the do's and don'ts of a healthy lifestyle. Now, there are many, today, diet fads is a very, very popular thing. So there's many people who went back to the Rambam's diet. You could Google it. I think it's something that even, Maimonides' diet is a thing that people are into. It's Maimonides' guide for a healthy lifestyle. It's not just a diet. It's pretty wide-ranging different dinim that the Rambam throws in over there. But the question is everything that it says in Perek Daled Hilchos Deis Torah? Let's say you plan on only learning Perek Daled Hilchos Deis. Do you make Brechas HaTorah? Do you need to make Brechas HaTorah? Are you allowed to learn Perek Daled Hilchos Deis without Brechas HaTorah? Is it a machlekes? Are you arguing on the Rambam if you disagree with something that it says here? If modern medicine disagrees with the meaning, how do we go to looking at Perek Daled Hilchos Deis? Is it Chachmas Atzmai? Is it Torah Shebal Peh? Is it a mix of both of them? Where does Perek Daled Hilchos Deis fit in? Now, what's interesting is that Chazal, and we're really doing this backwards because we should have started with that, but we'll get to it. Chazal throughout Shas have a tremendous amount of similar things that the Rambam is discussing, and Refuas HaTalmud is another topic we have to discuss. If that itself is something that needs to be, we'll get to that. Now, in this question, I just want to be makdim like this. The Chasam Sofer, not just the Chasam Sofer, but I'll quote you the Chasam Sofer just because he's a very flashing way of saying it. But the Chasam Sofer has a tshuva in Yeridei and Simukuf Aleph, where he's handling if a person, is there bittul b'shishim by cooking meat and fish together. We know that meat and fish you're not supposed to eat mishum sakana, mishum davar acher. The Gemara is mashma because of tzaras, which means it's not a halacha izach, it's not asur like basar b'chol like sederaisa. It's a sakana thing, and it's gebracht in Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Sakana, and the simon that talks about sakana is where it's gebracht. There's smatterings of it other places, but that's where it's be'ikar brought in Kuf Tazayin Yeridea. And the Chasam Sofer wants to know, let's say a bittul b'shishim on those, on cooking milk and meat and fish together, could you be samech on shishim or not? Now he brings a Taz, but the Taz says that since chamir sakanta meisura, we can't say that. Shishim works for things that are Isser. Chamir Sekanta B'Isur, we don't say it. Now, others argue and say that no, Chamir Sekanta B'Isur, the Shach, and Kutz Kesef argues, the Shach says no, Chamir Sekanta B'Isura is like Sveikis. Anytime you have a suffix, if something's Asr, or something's Mutter, or something's, does it exist, does it not exist, Chamir Sekanta B'Isura. But like Hilchas Bittel, the dinim, that this is the ratio that's Mevatel Blias is something, Mechates Chamir Sekanta B'Isura. This is Machlekes the Shach and Taz. Now, someone asked Chum Sefer the Shailin in Yerdei and Shuvah Kof Aleph, the Chum Sefer discusses it, and he brings something interesting. He brings from the Marshal, in Parak Gidanasha, in Chulin, in Siman Tesvav, where the Marshal says like this: Midaloi hevi harambam hach the marbar Rashi the Psachim the benisa the atvi bahad the bisra asal michla filu b'milcha. Since the Rambam doesn't bring this din, which comes from a Gemara Psachim mishum sakanta, shmamina dehu beroiv b'kiyuse b'tivius b'refuos yada the bricha in amazik. The Berecha in Imazik. I'm sorry, the Berecha in Imazik. The Rambam, who was an excellent doctor, knew that what the Gemara talked about only applied to certain contexts, not to every context. Vashas Ma'iri, Shnitva and Basar Mamish, v'chulu v'chulu. This is what Rambam says. Now the Chasam Sofer continues, and he says, one second, I want to find you the exact line. He eventually continues and he says he wants to be makel about the Shaila, and he says like this. He says, El Mishum de Chazinan la Rambam, the Rav Guvrei b'Refuas. He was a major expert in refuah. V'tiviyos shehishmet hanal al karchach nisa b'chakirusay umatzah shenishtana ativim bazeh. So he's taking the Rambam's medical prowess and medical expertise and using it as a rationale to paskin a shaila in Hilchos Yerdei and a Siman in Shulchan Aruch and Kuf Tazayin, a big machlekes between the Shach and the Taz. And the Rambam says, I'm being saimich on the Rambam's. The Chasam Sofer says, I'm being saimich on the Rambam's medical prowess to establish a halacha. And he's leaning on a marshal that says something very similar. Now, the Chasam Sofer later on in Shuvah Kufn and Dalet in Yerdei as well, in a complicated shaila of Hilchos Nida, again brings Neman Alai Harambam, Roisha Roifim, that he's someone who can be trusted to paskin the shaila. And the truth is that the marshal and the Chasam Sofer are not the only ones to say it. The Ramban and other Rishonim already call the Rambam the Avia Roifim and say we defer to him in any like medical question. The Birkei Yosef and Even Ezer and Seven Hay brings down B'Shem Taisvis Yamtif, who's quoting other early Rishonim, a Ramban and a Mukhi Yosef, that say that the Rambam's medical expertise is to be relied upon in any shaila that has to do with medicine. Like any medical halacha question, the Rambam's expertise is to be relied upon, and because he was an expert doctor. So now, putting that in context, framing it that way, you see the Gedei Achronim, I know Rabbi Yaakov Emden, not in Tshuva, but in Minchas Knayos, he says another similar thing like that. He says the Rambam, he machzavek with all like the medical knowledge of alchemy, and says that only the Rambam's alchemy is the alchemy that we trusted, because the Rambam was coming, the Rambam was a synthesis of Torah and medicine, and he's the one we should trust. So the Achronim and the Rishonim are all deferring to the Rambam as the Avia Roifim, the core doctor, and saying that any medical shayla should be deferred to him. So now, when we come to Perek Dalet Hilchos Deis, which is full of medical advice, which we'll see some of it is straight Gemaras, some of it are in ganzen Keneged Gemara, some of it is a blend, partially like the Gemara, partially not like the Gemara. How do you look at that? How do you dan that shayla? Legabe, is that Torah? Is it not Torah? Where does it stand? Now, I have over here a tshuva from Ramosha, not about this, it's a beautiful tshuva in Simon Chafei, in Archaim Dalet Chafei. Ramosha has a tshuva about Limud Torah. It's a beautiful tshuva, take a look if you want to see a nice tshuva. But in there he says, for Pashtus, and obviously I think this goes without saying, that someone who's going to spend his whole day learning only Beis Shammai Shitas is of course going to make Birchas HaTorah. The fact that we don't paskin like it doesn't make it not Torah. Right? Beis Shammai is Eich Torah, and Ramosha says like a beautiful thing, he says, even though he says you find, the Chashalemed Avu B'nai, V'rav Talmidai, Sheke'echad Gadol Harb Mechaver, one of them is much bigger than his friend, meaning the father is much bigger Talmid Chacham than his son, or the Rebbe is a much bigger Talmid Chacham than the Talmud, right? Meaning at the stage that they're learning. Kayis L'pa'amim Ha'aval Ben V'rav Talmidai. You find sometimes that the Rebbe can get frustrated. Anyone who's heard about Reb Aaron's share or various different Gedalah or Shiva Shiurim will know that frustration with silliness that a Talmud would suggest was a common feature of some of the fiery Shiurim that were delivered, and oftentimes fathers are not even able to learn with their sons because of this problem, because the father will get upset and he's can't this is why this chavrusas for kids and etc. But as this is what Moshe is referring to, that this is a common phenomenon. Aval B'Seif he says sheroya shegam das ben v'gam das talmud him dvarim nechayim u'ba'am lahashva. When eventually they realize that even what the Talmud is saying, even what the son is saying has value, sometimes they don't come to see eye to eye. The father, the Rebbe, still thinks he's right and the Talmud or the son is wrong. Eventually they realize that even the other perspective is worthy of being shared. It's worthy of being said. It's not nonsense. It's not nothing. So Moshe says, Agiret, that a day that's musker in the Gemara, even if we don't paskin like it, even if we wholesale don't paskin like it, like a Baskel came out and said, we don't paskin like this man Amar, Afal Pikein, the man Amar is Zichar Torah, and a person of course has to make a Birchas HaTorah if he's going to learn just Beishameh that day. Now, again, I'm just using this to frame the Rambams that we're going to discuss. Now, I want to show you something like this. The Malbim in Eitzes Chaim, the Malbim is a tremendous rationalist. The Malbim is afraid of nobody, ever. He's a mechadish. He'll say whatever he thinks is right. He says beautiful, beautiful, straightforward, rational things all the time. The Rambam in Eitzes Chaim, which incidentally, I forgot who they quoted from. Many Gedolim had tinus on the Malbim. The Malbim wrote a sefer Eitzes Chaim, which I'll say there Shulchan Aruch, and it's a beautiful sefer. I'll say the Shulchan Aruch, a beautiful, beautiful. I'll say there Chaim. The Malbim only wrote one volume. I think he only got I don't remember exact simon how many simanim in he got, but he wrote not too much of it, and he ended up getting I don't know, I can't say the word distracted, but he had other projects. The Rambam wrote on Olav Navi, the Malbim wrote on Chumash, Rambam wrote other things, and there was many Gedolim. I forgot who it is that said it about him, that like it's a shtickle zach, like he caused class for the Eitzes Chaim. He could have wrote the whole Eitzes Chaim and whole Chaim. Imagine how amazing that would have been. I remember after Chaim Kanievsky was nifted, there was like people were talking about this. Chaim Kanievsky spent, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes every day, responding to letters. And many of those letters were Mesiftabachim, asking a question or whatever. Some of them were serious, a lot of them were not very serious. And if Chaim felt that since he didn't have a yeshiva and he wasn't a marbitz Torah in the classical sense, that this was his chiyuv of Harbatzas HaTorah to make himself available, the encyclopedia that he was, to make himself available to people who want to ask questions. And L'mashal, Rav Chaim Kanievsky published Derech Emunah on Zeraim, which is off the charts, amazing, amazing sefer. Anybody who's learning Zeraim. And Rav Chaim had started publishing on Kachim, Derech Chachma, on the Rambam and Kachim, and he only got into, just a few prakim. He didn't get too deep in. And it was like people were saying, like, imagine if Rav Chaim would have gotten to the whole Derech Chachma. Like he would have finished. There's nothing like that on like the Derech Chachma. He would have covered Kachim, from Aleph bis Taf, with the Chazanishes, Mesaira and Chinuch, but alas, it's not meant to be. And the Eitzes Chaim is a similar sefer. Like the Malbim Eitzes Chaim is like a beautiful sefer, but it's incomplete work. Now, in any case, in today's all Hakdamas. Everything today is Hakdama. In Eitzes Chaim, in Siman Dalid, in the Eretz Yehuda, it's divided in Hameir La'aretz and Eretz Yehuda. That's how he wrote, like a longer period and a shorter period. In the Eretz Yehuda, the Malbim writes, he says, Zeh Yamim Rabim, he quotes a tshuva that he wrote. Zeh Yamim Rabim, Hishafti tshuva l'shelas chacham echad, be'isha shenatla tapuchim kvushim min achavis, shemin nechvashim behem, be'yadeha koidem netilas yadayim. A woman took out, she had like a pickling jar, I guess there was apples that were pickling, whatever, and she took out an apple from the pickling jar before she washed Netilas Yadayim. And the shaila is, we know, Chazal say, that the tumah that's on the hands is very dangerous. It's Gemara in Shabbos. Gemara says many examples of the danger of it, and what's the din with these apples? The Malbim writes as follows, Tshuva. We go to the Hakdama, the sugya of why we wash Netilas Yadayim. There's tumah, there's taras yadayim, and there's ruach ra. He says, Zulas kasher mashru kol kli beis Rabbeinu Hagadol HaRambam, except for one person. When you look through all the kalim of the Rambam's house, nimtzaki b'chiburi perak dalid, kasav shetzarach lit l'yadav shachas shem tefillah, v'lehizke shetzarach lit l'gim upam dafkim shem ruach ra. The Rambam doesn't bring anything about ruach ra, and this is a pattern in the Rambam's Sfarim. The Rambam doesn't bring anything about ruach ra. Ve'ein safek etzli shemizeh raya l'mashkasav rashal b'yab shashleim perak al-abasar shach shevein ruach ra matzi b'deinu. The Marshal, in a famous shtickle in Chulin, the Marshal writes that ruach ra is not a gave, it's not a zen. He says it's borrowed to me that the Marshal was learning that from the Rambam. The Ken Kasabel Yerabba b'shem domestic Eliezer shach shevein isharim b'kol zeh k'moilin in gilev v'zugais tam zeh hishmet gam Rambam atam shu ruach ra. It's really the any matzah yom. V'chshetivdik b'sefer hayad la Rambam tirish b'chol sifrei lehizkir afgam david b'chol azharas haskulas hamuskaras b'shas. He brings nothing of what we would call schools. Now, schools over here is a catch-all term. He doesn't mean schools the way we use schools today. Schools means anything that can't be, documented medically or physically, like proven like that in the regular scientific method. He says the Rambam leaves that all out. So much changed, the diet changed, the environment changed, the alchemy changed, and mainly we can't bring any riots anymore from that. Famous Taisis in Ma'id Katan. Fine. In any case, then he says, to add a little oomph, a little punch to what I'm saying, Bana iti ve'ercha. Come now for me with a little scenic route. He says, come with me, I want to show you something. Ve'ercha perek shalim b'divrei Rambam. I'll show you a full perek in the Rambam. Shu perek dalad milchas deis. Shediber sham ba'an hagas habrius. He talks over there about how to be healthy. V'rubai kekulei seisel divrei hashas, says the Malbim. Rubai Kikulai is Saisa what it says in Shas. Kimasha Kasav, and then he goes off, and this is like a Talmud Chacham Dik on the highest level. It's mamish like it's Ragachavari, like one line, like one word, like this that he writes about this, ayin there. This he writes about this, ayin there, and he brings like 20 examples of things that are in the Rambam Perek Daled that don't stem with Chazal. So he says, he continues on. He says, "Memela, Mfimash Kasav Hayla the Rambam Lahashman and Zeh." 1 second. V'hashta achashala harambam elachish bezman hazeh asakana shurach ra. He says now that you see the Rambam clearly did not hold you have to be worried about ruach bezman hazeh. Meila afagav shator v'shulchan aruch haziru liti yadav gemul pam b'shmurach ra. Even though the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch are maskim and are makbid that a person should wash his hand 3 times because of ruach ra. V'roy l'chol b'nefesh lizar b'zeh. And taka everybody should be zayir in that. Ki b'zayir mevur the zulat satsakana ruach toma shara l'yadayim v'deshav v'chozman and v'mkamis kamakim l'inyan di'evid l'asar ma'achal al yadei kain kedai hu a Rambam l'smachal of kol kain early bar. So the Rambam does this big kula, and he says you can be semich on the Rambam, even though the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah paskin that we're worried about ruach ra, the Rambam's not, and you can be semich on it. But Teichad Advarim over here, putting aside what the Tshuva is actually about, the Malbim takes one big broad swipe at the whole Perek Daled and Hilchos Deis and says that it's all Rubai Kikulei Keneged HaTalmud. Now, he doesn't mean to say that the Rambam can't write it because of that. He means to say that it's Chachmas Atzmai. The Rambam understood that some of those things were Chachma of the day, and the Rambam is editing it. Now, what I just said is a very controversial thing, and I'm just throwing it out there, but we'll get to it in full. Meaning, if the Rambam held that he could argue on the Gemara and Chachmas Atzmai, the way the Malbim is framing it, and say his own medical things, connected the Gemara's things, that seems to imply that the Rambam understood the Gemara's things to also be medical knowledge, some of the medical things in the Gemara. Now, that is a highly, highly controversial hapa and topic. Rabbi Meiselman from Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Meiselman, in his Sefer Torah and Science, a good, 30, 40 pages is about that exact sentence that I said, which is probably not Oisgehalten according to many. We'll discuss it. You know what I'm saying? I'm just putting it out there. We'll discuss it. There's Chuvas from Rishonim, there's a Rashba, there's Chuvas Hagainim about it. We'll talk about it mitzvah in detail. But as is the Malbim Mashba, that's how he's learning. And the Malbim Mila says that all this that the Rambam is saying Perek Daled is Chachmas Atzmai. It's nothing. Now the problem is that the Malbim over here in Artzas Achayim is a Madura Kama. Because later on, years later, the Malbim, decades later into his life, I think, or not decades, I don't know, probably decades even, published a small kuntris called Allah L'Trufa. Now, it's ironic, irony would have it that in the newest edition, the republished edition of Eitzes Chaim, they put the Allah L'Trufa in the back of the Eitzes Chaim, which is ironic. That's not where the Malbim published it, and it's in direct conflict to everything that he says in this Tshuva. In Allah L'Trufa, which is Al Harambam Hilchos Deis Perek Daled, that's what the whole thing is about. The Malbim proceeds with Roiv Ge'enusai to show where, I'll read you his Akdama, he says here, Allah L'Trufa Lahater Peshel Ilmim, to close up the mouth, to open the mouth of the Ilmim, people don't know how to answer. Ma'adonis Ksil Lefateach, Al Mishkal HaTzedek V'Hayosher, Al Shochan Al Shefnei Hashem, Deshenim V'Shmenim Minim Megadim, Olim Rayonim Al Shochan HaKadosh, Ha'im K'Beis Melech HaGadol, Abir HaRoifim, Sar HaTivim HaRambam, the Abir HaRoifim, the leader of the doctors, the Sar HaTev of the Rambam, Benuyim L'Talpias Al Kvaid Melachim Ein Cheker, Rabbi Seinu HaKdoshim Chachmei HaTalmud Zal, to prove that everything that the Rambam says, the doctor says in Perek Daled of Hilchos Deis, is all Geboit Al Talmud. L'Falpal Ad Makom Sheyad Sichli Magas, V'Zeh Heichali Be'ezus Hashem. And to be Falpal, and there in the next, I don't know, whatever it is, 20 pages, the Malbim goes B'Roiv Ge'enusei to try to prove how everything that the Rambam does in Hilchos Deis Perek Daled that seems to be Seiser, the Chachmei HaTalmud, is Adarabah. It's in concert with the Gemara, so you have to figure out how to learn it. So the Malbim is very strong in his Madura Kama, but L'chaira in the Madura Basri he doesn't agree with this. Now, there's a Rav Chaim Kanievsky has a Talmud, Rav Ori Tiger. He's been to America a few times. I don't know, people have seen him, I think. He put out a Sefer Chayin Adas. It's the only Sefer like this on Hilchos Deis, on the Rambam. And in Perek Daled, he has, in Mamish, in true Rav Chaim Kanievsky style, he's a real Talmud. This farm looked like Rav Chaim Kanievsky's farm. Like, he's a real Talmud, but in Perek Daled and Akdam in the Biurim, he has a long, long beer where he collects everybody who ever spoke on how to look at Perek Daled of Hilchos Deis, and codifies them into groups. And basically there are 3 shittas. Shitta number 1 is that everything the Rambam says in Perek Daled of Hilchos Deis is Chachmas Atzmai, and therefore it's not Torah. I shouldn't say that. It might still be Torah, but it's not coming from Chazal. Shita number 2 is that it's a synthesis, it's a blend. The Rambam takes certain things from Chazal, certain things from his own, and blends them together. What makes that difficult is because oftentimes they're not agreeing with each other, they're arguing with each other. The Rambam could take a Gemara, let's say about Hakasas Dam, bring 3 of the facets, and then in the other 2 he says the exact opposite of what the Gemara says. So like it's hard to match that, to blend that. And Shita number 3 is that everything the Rambam brings is Me'ad Mas Kodesh. It comes from Chazal, its sources, Shrasha Meharei Kedem, and it could all be sourced back. And what's interesting is that the tzad that says that it's all Shrasha Meharei Kedem is the thinnest tzad. He compiles reams and reams of Mar Makomis, of people who spoke about this throughout their different kashas through the Rambam. And the first two that we said, either that it's a synthesis or that it's exclusively Chachmas Atzmai, seems to be the more popular day amongst the Achrayim, because it's the easier resolution to many, many, many kashas in the Rambam. But there are definitely those who say that it's, Torah Shlema. Now, what I wanted to talk about today was to go through the Rambam a little bit in Perek Daled Chesdeis. So we didn't get to that. Either we'll get to that next week, or we'll blend it in together when we talk about Refuas HaTalmud. We'll try to keep figuring it out. To be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.